In the world of fast forwards, there is one name that requires zero introduction.
My name's Carroll Shelby, and performance is my business.
He built some of the fastest race cars the world has ever seen and turned Ford into a brand synonymous with speed, dedicating his life to building some of the most amazing machines that are still so beloved today. But what if I told you Carroll Shelby had a spiritual twin, a car builder who was working at the tip of the African continent to also create some truly incredible cars that bared the blue oval? A man swimming with the big boys and punching well above his pay grade using the magic of power to weight, injecting fire-breathing monsters into micro machines, producing some Frankenstein beasts that were loved both by the South African public and by the executives in Detroit. A man who took family sedans and managed to make them faster than the BMW race cars of the day. If you'll allow me, I'd like to introduce you to the legend of Basil Green and his incredible Peranas. Basil Green seems to have petrol in his blood right from the very beginning, because he started his career as a mechanical apprentice before he moved to then Rhodesia to work in a copper mine. From there, he moved to England to work on a Climax F1 car. It's kind of unclear whether he worked directly for the Cooper Climax F1 team or just for a Cooper Climax customer car. But it is very clear that he did interact with the team on some technical level and really tuned his ability to tune an engine whilst up north. He eventually brought all these newfound skills back to South Africa and opened BG Speed Performance. They produce performance parts ranging from wheels all the way to custom engine manifolds. And eventually they started accumulating all these parts into bespoke kits for certain production cars. And Basil Green stood by his performance parts and ended up racing the parts that he had produced. He started by working with a Mini 850, which he bought out to 1,000 cc's. Then he moved to a Ford Anglia and finally to a Fiat 600. And it's here where you can really see the philosophy that came to define all of his cars for many, many decades to come. First, you take a car that's already light, and then you try and stuff in the largest motor that you can without upsetting the car's balance, purely to focus on the car's power to weight ratio. Then you customize the rest of the car, like the wheels, brakes, and suspension, to handle that increased power load. This was then paired with the incredible tuning ability that he had developed over in England. And this formula, this philosophy, came to define every single car that Basil Green touched. And the first full production car to benefit from this philosophy was the Cortina V6 Perana. Side note, the branding Perana came from Basil Green's wife, but Perana, the name, normal spelling was already taken, so he spells it P-E-R-A-N-A. Yeah, that's just that. Green had a real taste for Fords, and he picked the Cortina GT as the base for his first full production car. He pulled the 3-liter Essex from the V6 Zephyr and mated it to the Lotus Cortina gearbox. He lowered the ride height, added a Salisbury diff, and made general changes specifically to the rear suspension to be able to handle the brand new power plant. And somehow, despite all of these changes, the car was only 64 kilograms lighter than the standard Cortina GT. So you have this massive increase in power, but the weight basically stays the same. You could either buy this as a modification kit or as a fully tuned car from Perana themselves. And you could buy this car for 2,950 Rand. To put this into perspective, can you imagine walking into a dealership nowadays and buying a performance car like a GTI or a Type R with a full factory warranty for 310,000 Rand? That is insane. And these cars were so popular that they exported them to places like England and Australia. Green followed this up with a hopped up version of the Ford Escort. Ford had, for some reason, ordered too many RS 1600s, and for some mechanical reason, they weren't really suited to the climate and the taste of the South African public. And so they tasked Basil Green with making some modifications. And he obliged, subbing out the standard 1600 engine for a 2-liter Pinto engine. Still an increase in displacement, but not an enormous amount. but they managed to sell, and Ford was incredibly impressed with this performance from Green. But they had no idea that his magnum opus was just around the corner. Because in the late 1960s, Green started developing the Capri Perana. He started with the same SX V6 swap to a Mark I Capri 3000 XL, which was so successful that Ford ended up bringing him on as a consultant when they were working on their own V6 Capri. But when the prospect of racing was tabled, he canned the V6 for a 5-liter Windsor V8, truly living up to his philosophy of small car, massive engine. The power output of these cars changed over the years, but in its final iteration, the car could produce 220 kilowatts and went from 0 to 100 in 6.7 seconds, which in 1969, 1970 was an incredible bit of performance. Green then borrowed the Australian Ford Falcon's limited slip rear axle to handle the power, along with the typical lowering and tweaking of suspension that he did to all of his cars. This culminated in a car that could outsprint the Alfa Romeos and BMWs of the day in acceleration and in top speed. Flying the Gunston cigarettes livery, the Capri took on the SA Saloon Car Champs Group 5. And they ended up winning 13 of the 14 available races, and then went on to also dominate other championships in 71 and 72. If that's not a whitewash, I do not know what is. Following this success, Green released the second generation of the Cortina Perana, based on the new Mark III Cortina, but with the exact same changes and modifications that he had made in his previous iteration. Then Green actually moved away from his typical formula when he produced the Ford Grenada Perana, where he still upgraded the engine over stock. He injected the 5-liter Windsor V8 into the Granada, but this was not really tuned for racing, but more for smoothness and refinement. This was more of a GT car than a thoroughbred racer. But that did not mean it didn't possess the true tuning magic of Basil Green. And this car was so good, it caught the attention of then Ford president Lee Iacocca. If you didn't know, this is the guy who helped create the Mustang. Iacocca requested that Green send him a Grenada Perana to Detroit, and Iacocca ended up loving it so much that he made it his personal car. And this admiration from Lee Iacocca was not just a nice little tidbit in the story. It ended up becoming essential to Green's survival, because just as the Granada was about to hit the scene, the 1973 oil crisis happened. Suddenly, consumers and governments became unbelievably concerned about emissions and consumption, and any Perana model with its massively improved displacement does not really seem that appealing when you could just get a standard car with a smaller, more economical engine. This meant that Perana sales slumped dramatically, and Basil Green and the whole Perana brand were facing bankruptcy. But that was until Lee Iacocca heard about this concern and made a phone call. He phoned the head of Ford SA and demanded that Basil Green be given a dealership to sell just regular Fords to regular people. And Ford obliged. Basil Green Ford was established in the mid-1970s, where they sold standard Ford cars alongside the Peranas. And what's amazing is that it not only saved the company, but it's still around today. You can still just go to Edenvale and buy a Ford off their lot. Green plowed on selling normal Fords and pre-existing Perana models for years and years and years, but we actually didn't get a new Perana make until the early 80s with the Cortina XR3 Perana. It wasn't as a dramatic change as we usually expect from Peranas, with just custom tuning as opposed to a full engine replacement. He ended up tweaking the carbs of the standard car and adding custom inlet and exhaust manifolds. These small changes did manage to knock off 1.6 seconds from the 0 to 100 time, and they even went racing, both on track and in rally. Truly, it was clear that Green never lost his passion for creating wild cars. And this energy culminated in a very special final release for the Perana brand, which was the Sapphire Perana. This model actually came about because Green was just tweaking his everyday daily driver, and it was so good that they ended up putting it into production. You could get an option of two different engines, a 3-liter and a 3.4-liter. Both were thoroughly tuned with unique manifolds paired with special high-lift cams and custom headers. Once again, the ride height was lowered and the springs and dampers were stiffened to deal with the bigger power. When Car Magazine reviewed the 3.4-litre Sapphire in 1991, they said it was the fastest Ford they had ever tested. Plain and simple, but it still remained smooth and refined. This car was a truly fitting final chapter in the epic tale of Basil Green and his culminated life's work. A man so committed to his philosophy of power to weight that produced some truly incredible race cars, but also truly incredible road cars. In 2019, he was inducted into the South African Hall of Fame. I'm not talking about the South African Motoring Hall of Fame, but just the South African Hall of Fame, as to be acknowledged as one of South Africa's greatest sons. Sadly, 3 years later in 2022, Basil Green passed away, but he leaves behind a truly exceptional fleet of vehicles that are dearly beloved in this country. I promise you, if a Perana pulls up in a South African car show, it is going to get as much of a crowd as a Superbus or a Ford XR8. So when we're lauding the greats of the motoring world, the McLarens, the Chapmans, the Murrays, and the Shelbys, let's not forget about the man that made Ford a racing giant in the 1960s. A man whose prowess spilled over into Ford race cars and made Detroit take notice. Let's not forget Perana, and let's not forget Basil Green.